The thermometer outside Villa 14 Al Wasl Road, Dubai, read 44 degrees Celsius on the afternoon of March 3, 2019. The kind of heat that presses down on your chest like a hand that will not let go. But the real story that day was not the weather. Behind the whitewashed walls and perfectly manicured bougainvillea of one of Dubai's most coveted residential addresses, a tragedy was already in motion. A tragedy that would strip away every illusion of perfection that money and status had so carefully built. Her name was Nadia Al Farsi, 43 years old, a widow. The kind of woman people in Al Wasl described as extraordinary, beautiful in the way that takes effort, polished in the way that takes obsession. Her villa stood as a monument to everything she had once been, the wife of a celebrated Emirati property developer, the queen of a social world built on dinners, charity galas, and carefully worded compliments exchanged over Arabic coffee. James Al Farsi, her late husband, had died 8 months before that afternoon. A sudden cardiac arrest on his morning walk along Jumeirah Beach. He was 48. He left behind a grieving widow, a 3-story villa worth 11 million dirhams, a 4 million dirham life insurance policy, and a silence inside those walls that no amount of money could fill. What happened next was not a love story. It was a warning. And by the time Dubai's criminal investigation department had finished pulling at every thread, an entire community would be left asking themselves the same unbearable question. How did we all see this coming and say absolutely nothing? This is the story of Nadia Al Farsi and Aditya Nair, a story about loneliness, obsession, exploitation, and the terrible cost of silence. If this story moves you, educates you, or makes you stop and think, please subscribe to Exposed, True Crime Stories. Every subscription tells us that what we do matters, and it pushes us to keep going deeper, working harder, and telling the stories that the world needs to hear. Your support is the reason this channel exists. Al Wasl Road is not simply an address in Dubai. It is a declaration. The kind of street where gardeners arrive every morning at precisely 8 o'clock, where every car in every driveway is the right car, and where the unspoken rules of social order are more binding than any written law. Nadia Al Farsi had lived on this street for 11 years, arriving as the young wife of Hassan Al Farsi, one of the city's most respected real estate developers. In a neighborhood that measured worth in decades, 11 years was barely enough to belong. But Hassan's philanthropy and Nadia's relentless social precision had earned them their place. When Hassan died, Nadia's position became something difficult to name. She was no longer half of a power couple. She was not yet one of the quiet widows who disappeared into their memories and their housekeepers' routines. She existed in a strange middle space, too young, too beautiful, too wealthy to be ignored, but too alone to feel real. And that loneliness, the kind that settles into your bones in a silent villa that was built for two, became the most dangerous thing about her. 3 villas down, in the most modest home on the street, lived the Nair family. Sunita Nair had come to Dubai from Kerala, India, 17 years earlier with 2 suitcases and the kind of determination that people who have never had to struggle find difficult to understand. A registered nurse at Rashid Hospital, she had raised her son Aditya Nair entirely alone after her husband walked out when the boy was 6 years old, chasing debts and a woman who was not his wife back to Chennai. Aditya was 17 years old when this story begins. 6 feet tall, the anchor of his school swim team at Jumeirah English-speaking school, with a 4.1 GPA, a quiet intensity that his coaches mistook for maturity, and shoulders that had already attracted the attention of scholarship scouts from universities in the United Kingdom and Australia. The University of Melbourne had already made preliminary contact. A full athletic scholarship, the kind of opportunity that could rewrite not just one life but a family's entire history. Aditya Nair was the reason Sunita had worked double shifts for a decade. He was the reason she had taken out a second mortgage on their leased villa. He was the reason she had stayed in Dubai, far from her mother in Tiruvananthapuram, far from everything familiar, pouring every dirham she earned into his future. He was everything. And he was about to be taken from her in a way she never imagined. His swimming coach, Patrick D'Souza, would later describe Aditya Nair as the most gifted junior swimmer he had seen in 15 years of coaching in the UAE. The kind of athlete who made the water look cooperative. Twice regional champion. A boy who arrived at morning practice before anyone else and was still in the pool after everyone else had gone home. But by June of 2019, something had changed. His times began to slip. 2 seconds in the 200-meter freestyle. Then 4. Then the kind of decline that does not look like tiredness or overtraining. It looks like a mind somewhere else entirely. I asked him if everything was okay. D'Souza would later tell investigators. He told me he was tired from extra work helping a neighbor with maintenance, helping with her pool, her garden. He said the money was helping his mother. I thought it was responsible. I thought it was admirable. I should have looked closer. The truth had a different shape entirely. It had begun on April 7, 2019. A Sunday morning. Aditya had arrived at Nadia's villa at 9:30 to clean her pool, a job he had taken 3 times a week since Hassan's death, arranged through the building management company that looked after several properties on the street. Security camera footage retrieved during the investigation would later show what happened that morning with the kind of clinical precision that makes tragedy feel almost worse, because you can see every step toward it and still cannot stop it. Nadia appeared at the pool at 10:47. Her steps were unsteady. Her eyes were red. She was carrying a glass of something that was not water. That morning would have been Hassan's birthday. He would have turned 49. She had found, tucked in the back of their bedroom closet, a gift she had bought and never given him. A watch, still in its box, still wrapped. She stood at the edge of the pool watching Aditya work for 3 full minutes before she spoke. What she said was simple. What it cost both of them was everything. Aditya Nair had been raised to be respectful, to be kind, and above all, to understand that the adults in his life deserved deference. Sunita had built that into him with the same care she had built everything else, carefully, painstakingly, at great personal cost. So when Nadia Al Farsi stood at the edge of her pool and simply broke, not dramatically, not loudly, but in the quiet, suffocating way of someone who has been performing strength for so long that the performance finally gives out, Aditya did what he had been raised to do. He stopped working. He listened. He offered the kind of full, unhurried attention that lonely people will mistake for something it is not. She was not Mrs. Al Farsi in that moment, he would later write in the private notebook that investigators would find months later. She was just a woman drowning in a grief that nobody around her seemed to have time for anymore. The first touch was ordinary. Her hand on his arm as she spoke. His awkward, well-meaning pat on her shoulder. And then something that lingered a moment too long. The security footage showed them standing too close together for 9 minutes. What crossed between them in those 9 minutes would unravel 2 lives. Their meetings became frequent under the cover of pool maintenance and garden work. Nadia had a keypad lock installed on the pool house, telling the building management it was for liability purposes. The code was 0407, the date of their first conversation. Text messages began on burner phones purchased from 2 separate electronics shops in Dara. The messages were careful at first, then urgent, then desperate. April 22, 11:14 p.m. Nadia, pool filter making a noise. Can you check tomorrow? Aditya, tomorrow is not my scheduled day. Nadia, some things cannot wait. By May, the financial entanglement had deepened. Bank records would later show Nadia withdrawing significant cash amounts. 3,000 dirhams here, 6,000 there. Aditya began appearing at school in clothes that a 17-year-old boy whose mother worked double nursing shifts could not explain. A new watch, a MacBook, designer trainers that his teammates noticed and mentioned. His scholarship offer stopped arriving. His times in the pool kept slipping. His world was quietly, methodically collapsing, and he was too deep inside something he did not fully understand to see it. In Al Wasl, reputation is everything. Confrontation is nothing. And so the neighbors of Villa 14 did what people in places built on appearances almost always do. They watched, they whispered, and they waited for someone else to speak first. Fatima Hassan, a retired schoolteacher whose villa had a direct line of sight to Nadia's front gate, kept a personal journal. She had kept one since her years teaching in Sharjah, and her entries during the summer of 2019 would become some of the most significant evidence in the entire investigation. The boy's car was parked outside again at 2 in the morning, she wrote in July. I told myself it was nothing. I have been telling myself it is nothing for 3 months. I'm not sure I believe myself anymore. At Jumeirah English Speaking School, Counselor Mrs. Georgina Verghese had begun keeping a separate file on Aditya Nair. His grades had fallen from a 4.1 to a 2.6 in 2 terms. He fell asleep in class. He stared at his phone during lessons, something the teachers described as entirely unlike the boy they had known. His Melbourne scholarship inquiry had gone quiet. Sunita Nair felt it too. A mother's knowledge that lives in the body before it reaches the mind. She noticed the new clothes. She noticed the silences. She noticed the way her son, who had once told her everything, now gave her answers that were technically true but somehow entirely empty. She was working 12-hour shifts at Rashid Hospital. She was exhausted. She told herself it was teenage distance. She told herself it would pass. At the Dubai Ladies Club, where Nadia had once been a fixture at the tennis courts and the Friday brunches, her friends noticed changes they chose not to name directly. She stopped coming to the courts. She arrived at social events in clothes that were younger than she had ever worn before, then stopped arriving at all. Her phone was always in her hand, screen angled away. She's grieving, her friends told each other. Give her time. But grief was not what was happening behind the walls of Villa 14. What was happening was something that every single person in that community saw clearly and chose, deliberately, to look away from. The first blackmail demand arrived on August 10, 2019. A plain envelope slipped under the villa gate containing photographs taken through the pool house window. The demand was 150,000 dirhams. Silence in exchange. Security footage from that evening showed Nadia running barefoot across her marble courtyard, phone pressed to her ear. She called her bank. She called her lawyer. And then, at 11:47 p.m., she called Aditya. The recording of that call, retrieved from the pool house security system, would later be played in a Dubai courtroom. It was the sound of a woman who had stopped calculating risk and started calculating escape. She wanted to run. She had money. She had contacts. She had already searched flight routes. Nadia's laptop browser history would show searches for one-way tickets to destinations with no extradition agreements with the UAE. She wanted to take him with her. Aditya was 17 years old. Sunita Nair discovered the truth on August 14th. She was doing laundry when she found, folded inside her son's school jacket, a receipt. A piece of jewelry from a boutique in the Dubai Mall. 9,000 dirhams. Her son, who earned 400 dirhams a week cleaning pools. Hidden in his desk drawer, wrapped in an old swim meet program, she found a burner phone. She sat on the edge of her son's bed in her nursing uniform at 2 in the morning and read through hundreds of messages that collapsed everything she had understood about her life. The confrontation that followed was the worst moment of her existence. He looked at me with a watch on his wrist that I could never have afforded him, she would later tell the court, her voice barely holding. And he told me I was imagining things. My son. The boy I raised alone for 17 years. He stood in front of me and told me I was imagining things. The second blackmail demand arrived August 25th. 300,000 dirhams. This time with video footage from inside the pool house. Nadia paid it the same afternoon, emptying an account Hassan had designated for a charitable foundation he had planned to establish in his name. Detective Hamid Youssef of the Dubai Criminal Investigation Department would later describe the financial trail as a cascade. Each withdrawal feeding the next crisis. Each crisis pushing both of them further from the possibility of stopping. She was not thinking about consequences anymore, Youssef would testify. She was thinking about survival, and she had confused survival with escape. By September 1, 2019, Aditya Nair had been suspended from the school swim team. The Melbourne Scholarship Inquiry had been formally withdrawn. The school administration, having received written communications from Sunita Nair and from 2 anonymous sources, had contacted the Dubai authorities. The community's silence had finally broken, not out of courage but because it had become impossible to maintain. Nadia's social world evaporated almost overnight. Her name was quietly removed from charity event committees. Her tennis club membership was placed under review. Friends who had known her for a decade stopped returning her calls. In her study, investigators would later find a half-written letter. It had begun as an apology to Hassan. It had ended as a farewell to Aditya. Detective Youssef would identify this letter as the moment he understood that they were out of time. When we found that letter, he would later reflect, I knew we were no longer dealing with a situation that would resolve itself. We were dealing with a situation that was going to end. Sunita Nair called the CID at 11:38 p.m. on September 3, 2019. Her son had come home to pack a bag. He had told her he was leaving, that they had planned it, that he was going with her. Please, she said on that call, her voice shaking with the specific terror of a mother who understands exactly what she is about to lose. Please stop them before it is too late. The officers were already moving. They were not quite fast enough. March 3, 2019 had been the beginning. September 4, 2019, was the end. Security cameras at Villa 14 Al Wasl Road captured Aditya Nair's silver Toyota arriving at 12:43 a.m. headlights off. The temperature outside was still 33 degrees. The night was heavy and still. Nadia waited in the pool house. 2 one-way tickets to Kuala Lumpur. Stacks of cash. A packed travel bag. On the desk that Hassan had restored himself, a piece of furniture he had spent 3 weekends on, determined to do it with his own hands, lay a letter she had not finished writing. The exterior camera captured Aditya walking toward the pool house. His face, even in the grainy timestamp footage, was different from the face of the boy who had arrived at this villa 6 months earlier. Something in it had hardened. Something had decided. The pool house security system recorded everything that followed. She laid out the plan. He listened in silence. And then, in the voice of a boy who had finally arrived at a shore he had been swimming toward without realizing it, he said what he had perhaps needed to say for months. I am 17 years old. This has to stop. My mother knows everything. The school has contacted the police. This ends tonight. What followed was captured on audio with a kind of fidelity that makes it hard to listen to even now. Nadia's response moved through pleading, through bargaining, and then through something else entirely, a rage that had perhaps always been there beneath the carefully maintained surface. The forensic analysis would later describe a struggle lasting 94 seconds. A crystal ornament struck the wall. Raised voices. The sound of movement. Aditya turning to leave. Nadia grabbing his arm. A physical confrontation between a woman who could not accept an ending and a boy trying desperately to reach one. And then the sound no one who heard that recording would ever forget. The medical examiner's report was precise. Dr. Ananya Joseph, senior forensic pathologist, testified that Nadia Al Farsi had fallen backward, striking the corner of Hassan's restored desk. The angle of impact. The force involved. Death was nearly instantaneous. At 12:46 a.m., Aditya Nair walked out of the pool house. Security footage shows him standing in the courtyard for 38 seconds, looking at his hands in the ambient glow of the garden lights. Then he walked to his car with the careful, mechanical movement of someone whose mind has not yet caught up with what his body has done. Sunita Nair called emergency services at 1:04 a.m. My son just came home. There is blood. Please God, please come. The first responders arrived at Villa 14 at 1:17 a.m. Officer Rashid Al-Ameri, first on the scene, would later say that the pool house door was open and the lights were still on. What they found inside was the full cost of every moment of silence that had come before. By dawn, Wasl Road was cordoned off. News vans arrived with the morning light. Neighbors stood behind police barriers in their nightclothes, watching a stretcher being wheeled through gates that had once opened for catered dinner parties and charity committee meetings. Aditya Nair was formally charged on September 7, 2019. The charge was involuntary manslaughter. He was 17 years old. He was taken into custody in a school swim team jacket he had grabbed without thinking when he left his house that night. His mother stood outside the courthouse in her nurse's uniform, having come directly from a 12-hour shift, and watched her son walk inside. The trial lasted 7 weeks. The prosecution built its case on 212 pieces of physical evidence, security footage, 3,400 text messages, and financial records documenting 260,000 dirhams in transfers. Frame by frame, the jury watched the story of a 17-year-old boy being systematically drawn away from his future, his family, and his own sense of reality by a woman who was old enough to know exactly what she was doing. The defense, led by attorney Khalid Haydam, did not deny what had happened. What it asked the court to hold simultaneously was this: that the defendant was a victim and the deceased was also a victim, and that justice required the courage to hold both truths at once. Expert psychologist Dr. Suresh Balakrishnan testified about grooming patterns in adolescence. The gifts, the secrecy, the financial dependency, the deliberate isolation from family. Every behavior he described had a documented counterpart in Aditya's case. The boy on that witness stand was not the boy who had won regional swimming championships 2 years earlier, Balakrishnan told the court. He was a child who had been methodically taught to believe that what was being done to him was love. Fatima Hassan read from her journal for 40 minutes. Every entry was dated. Every detail was precise. She had seen everything. She had written everything down. She had said nothing to anyone until it was far too late. Her testimony was devastating, not because it condemned anyone but because it condemned a culture. We all saw it, she told the court quietly. We all saw it and we decided it was not our place to speak. I have not slept a full night since September 4th. I do not expect to again. The verdict came down on November 12, 2019. Involuntary manslaughter. Guilty. The judge, acknowledging both the loss of life and the documented exploitation that had led to it, sentenced Aditya Nair to 4 years, with eligibility for parole after 2. He noted that the defendant, while legally responsible for Nadia Al Farsi's death, had himself been a victim of a pattern of adult exploitation that the entire community around him had observed and failed to interrupt. There are no winners in this courtroom, the judge said before delivering the sentence. There are only different depths of loss. Sunita Nair, seated in the gallery in the same nurse's uniform she had worn to every single day of the trial, pressed her hands flat against her knees and stared straight ahead as her son was led away. She did not cry in the courtroom. She had cried everything she had at home in private in the weeks and months before this moment. What was left was something quieter and harder, the face of a woman who had survived something unsurvivable and was not entirely sure what came next. The ripples from Villa 14 Al Wasl Road spread through Dubai the way ripples always do in tight, wealthy communities, quietly at first, then everywhere at once. Sunita Nair took a leave of absence from Rashid Hospital. The colleagues who had respected her for 15 years now looked at her with a sympathy she found harder to bear than anything else. She sold the leased villa, the one she had mortgaged twice to keep Aditya in the schools and the city he needed, and moved to a smaller apartment in Dera, closer to the facility where her son now lived. At Gemini English-speaking school, the swim team held a quiet season with a captain nobody discussed publicly. Coach D'Souza resigned at the end of the year. In his letter to the school board, he wrote that some things leave marks that training cannot swim out of. The Melbourne scholarship was formally withdrawn in October. The letter arrived at a flat Aditya would not return to for 2 years. Aditya was released on parole after 22 months for demonstrated good behavior and completion of a rehabilitation program. He did not return to competitive swimming. He enrolled in a distance learning program and moved to Sharjah, where his mother had found new work at a clinic. He has not spoken publicly about what happened. His mother has spoken about almost nothing else. Because Sunita Nair, in the crucible of the worst thing that had ever happened to her, found the thing she needed to do with what remained of her. She founded the Aditya Foundation, a support group for parents navigating unexplained changes in their children's behavior, originally operating out of a community center in Dera, eventually expanding to chapters across the UAE, India, and the United Kingdom. Her speaking engagements at nursing conferences and school parent evenings focused on a single question. What does exploitation look like before it has a name? She became one of the most compelling advocates for the Mitchell-Anderson Act's equivalent legislation in the UAE, mandatory training for school staff, domestic workers, and community associations on recognizing and reporting inappropriate adult-child relationships. At Rashid Hospital, where she eventually returned to work, she developed a screening protocol for adolescent patients that has since been adopted by 3 other hospitals in the Emirati. Fatima Hassan, the retired teacher whose journal had documented everything and whose silence had documented something even more important, became the founding patron of the Aditya Foundation. Her speaking notes, she once told a parent evening audience, begin with the same sentence every time. I watched it happen. I wrote it all down. And I said nothing. That is my contribution to this tragedy, and it is something I will spend the rest of my life trying to undo. Detective Hamid Youssef retired from the CID in 2023. He kept the case file on his desk until his final day. In an interview with Gulf News, he said, "In 22 years of investigations, this case taught me the most. Not about criminals. About communities. About the extraordinary capacity of ordinary people to look directly at something terrible and decide, very quietly, that it is not their responsibility." The villa at Al Wasl Road sold 3 years after the trial. The new owners demolished the pool house and built a covered terrace in its place. Open air. Nothing hidden. The neighbors on the street noted the change without comment. In the meditation garden that the Aditya Foundation eventually established at a community park in Jumeirah, there is a small stone plaque. The community argued about what it should say for longer than they argued about almost anything else. In the end, they settled on something simple. For those we failed to protect. May we learn. May we watch. May we speak. Dubai does not easily surrender its image of perfection. The gleaming towers, the curated streets, the villas with their bougainvillea and their security cameras and their carefully maintained distance between one life and the next, all of it insists on a version of the world where things like this do not happen here. But they do happen here. They happen everywhere. And the distance between a tragedy unfolding and a tragedy prevented is almost always this. One person, one moment, choosing to speak when everything in their world is telling them to stay quiet. Sunita Nair lost almost everything. And from what remained, she built something that has protected hundreds of children she will never meet. That is not a happy ending. But it is the closest thing to justice that a story like this one allows. Thank you for watching Exposed, True Crime Stories. If this story has stayed with you, if it has made you think differently, look more closely, or simply understand the weight of silence a little more clearly, please subscribe to our channel. We tell these stories because they matter. Your subscription is what makes it possible for us to keep telling them with the depth and the honesty they deserve. Every subscriber reminds us why we do this work. Please subscribe, share, and help us reach the people who need to hear these stories most.